Good evening to everyone. Appreciate everyone being back. It's been another beautiful day, beautiful afternoon. First and foremost, thanks to all the young men that was there at the song leader training this evening. We had 5 of those guys showed up, and appreciate you being here. But I guess most importantly, since none of them can drive, we'll thank your parents for getting you here on time. I appreciate that. It's encouraging to me. Even if you're not a song leader and you want to learn a little bit more, I learn something every time I go. Jeff was making some of them do some stuff out there this afternoon, writing in some notes between some measures, and of course Anderson had to get up and show off a little bit. You know, he's kind of the star student there with some of that stuff, start putting in all these quarter and 16th notes and stuff. But appreciate them doing that, appreciate them being there. Look forward to seeing what they can accomplish coming up here in the future. Tonight, for just a few minutes of your time, I told the high school class this morning we was going to look at 2 chapters out of Genesis, and they thought this was going to last for an eternity. But it's not. We're going to go quick. We'll be short tonight, I think. We're going to talk about Joseph. Of course, this year's theme for Last Leaders is but God meant it for good. This verse takes place in Genesis chapter 50 and verse 20. We're going to back up a little. We're going to be a couple of chapters back. We're going to look at chapters 45 and 46. But before we start there, I hate to start right in the middle of the ending of a story, so we're going to catch up just a little bit and run through some highlights maybe of Joseph's life, which of course Joseph was one of Jacob's sons. He was his 11th son. He also very quickly, we find out in Genesis 37 and 3, he was that favorite son. He was that chosen one, right? He was the favorite child of his 11 other brothers. And shortly after that verse was said, we find Joseph receiving a gift with that coat of many colors, which he was raised in Hebron. And Joseph, after receiving that coat, ended up having a couple of dreams. One of binding the sheaves, the wheat, that bowed down to him, and of course the 11 stars, the sun, the moon, which bowed to him as well. So he made the mistake, I guess, of speaking these dreams to his brother and even his father and mother, and that didn't turn out too well for Joseph. A little later on there, his father had sent him to the field to check on his brothers, and once they seen him coming, they referred to him as the dreamer. His brothers actually wanted to take his life. Now, I can't imagine living in a home or living in a house to where my brothers, my family, even to this point, were so convinced that they needed to kill their brother, that there was so much hatred there. But instead, they were talked into throwing him into a pit, where he spent a little time there and finally was decided to be sold as a slave to the Ishmaelites. And he was sold into slavery and ended up with Potiphar, of course. As he served as a slave for Potiphar, he was also an officer to Potiphar. He was promoted there. So we see him starting his career. Even as a slave, he started his career as a servant. Shortly thereafter, through the story, we find him and Potiphar's wife having some issues, and he was thrown into prison. After being in prison for a while, he even became kind of an authority over the prisons, but he interpreted some dreams in prisons, and then was finally called to interpret the dreams of Pharaoh. Whereas a young man that started out as a slave is now promoted as an overseer, as someone in his 30s, he is promoted to oversee the whole land of Egypt. He actually prevented the starvation of thousands. He overseen that famine that was coming upon the land. Jacob had sent his sons. I can't imagine living in a system to where we had went 2 years without any crops, without any food production. So Jacob sends his sons to get food from Egypt, except for Benjamin, that younger brother of Joseph. Joseph recognizes his brothers there in Egypt, and he sent for Benjamin to return. So here where we're fixing to pick up, very closely here, Joseph's brothers are back in Egypt to buy grain for the family. And due to this famine that's occurring at this time, Joseph is going to enact his plan with Benjamin. He has that silver cup, if you remember the story, and placed it in the bag and sends the brothers away, fully expecting his brothers to abandon Benjamin. Joseph likely sees himself here in this picture, or as I would see myself, I would be the rescuer. I would be going to save Benjamin from these brothers of mine that had done this to me. But Joseph gets a big surprise. Rather than abandoning Benjamin to Egypt, they return to him, and they offer their lives for their brother's sake. Judah, the one who had sold Joseph into slavery, he was the one who was willing to trade his life and set Benjamin free so he could return to his father. This brings us up to where we'll begin in Genesis 45. Everybody loves the climax of a story, right? When you're watching that movie or you're have this expectations of this big event that's coming. We even have now all of these reveal parties that take place with all different kinds of events. This is what's fixing to happen. We're fixing to have a reveal. Joseph, completely astonished by his brothers, in Genesis chapter 45, there beginning, he can't control himself any longer. He sends everyone out of the room, and he tells his brothers who he is. Joseph at this point had broken down. Bible says he was crying so hard and so loudly that the Egyptians that he sent away, they heard him as well as Pharaoh's household. Joseph then asked again if his father is still alive. If you notice in verse number 3 of this text, though, his brothers at this point in time, I believe, are so scared, so fearful, they can't even answer. They're terrified to be in their brother's presence. These brothers thought Joseph was dead. Now they realize they are actually standing before an extremely powerful ruler over all of the land. Can you imagine all the things that would be running through your mind? Think about for just a minute. If you was Joseph, what would you say to your brothers at this point? These are the brothers who hated you. These are the brothers who couldn't find a kind word to speak about you. You know he was probably picked on, made fun of. These are the brothers that when you brought dreams to them that God had spoken to you, God had given to you, they wanted to kill you. These are the brothers that put you in a pit and sit around and eat lunch. And I'm sure there was laughter and cheers. These are the brothers that sold you into slavery. These are the brothers that ruined your life. So you thought. What are you going to say to these brothers now who are standing before you and you have really the ultimate power over their lives? As this text continues on, clearly these brothers, I can't imagine that they would have thought this was going to go well. If you were those brothers and you looked up and you seen someone who controlled your life, your future. I think most of us within that moment would truly be terrified. I think they were totally dismayed at his presence. If you look at Genesis 45, verses 5 through 8, and listen to what Joseph tells him, though. And now, do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve your life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are yet 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. And God sent me before you to preserve you a remnant on earth and keep you alive for your many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me the father to Pharaoh and the Lord of all of his house and the ruler over the land of Egypt. If you mark in your Bibles, Joseph said something there 3 different times. Joseph said, God sent me. In verse number 5, he says it in verse number 7, and then Joseph underscores it again in verse number 8. He's looking and talking directly to his brothers that had done all of these things to him. And he said, so it is not you who sent me here, but God. Now for just a moment, think about where Joseph's view was in his life of God right now at this moment. Joseph's able to tell his brothers, he said, look guys, don't be distressed. Don't be angry. Don't be upset with yourselves. If you go back and read through some of these chapters ahead of this, you'll see that, we had heard these brothers say that as they were before Joseph, that God was bringing a reckoning on them for their guilt regarding Joseph. But Joseph tells them here, he said, look, stop the guilt. Stop the anger. It wasn't you. God sent me here. God put me here in this moment, in this time. Not only here does Joseph not speak harshly or bring vengeance on his brothers, Joseph shows his family kindness. He tells his brothers, he said, look, you need to hurry home and tell Father that I'm alive and quickly move down to Egypt in Genesis 45:9. And then Joseph says that he'll provide for them. There's going to be 5 more years of this famine that's going to be coming. This means Joseph here in this point, probably in his late 30s. Not only this, but Joseph goes then and hugs Benjamin, and he kisses his brother. Pharaoh then, verses 17 and 18, confirms everything that Joseph had proclaimed to him. He said, bring your family to Egypt. Gather up your whole family. Think about this, not just you. Bring your whole family. Bring everybody with you. And enjoy the riches that we have here in this land. If you look on down into verse 20, into this chapter, he said, don't even worry about packing your belongings, because all of the best of Egypt will be yours. Joseph gives his brothers one more instruction here before they begin this journey. He tells them not to fight and argue along the way. Now, from my looking at this, different people have different ideas, but this was roughly 450 miles. You're looking at 15 days at 30 miles a day. I don't know if they traveled quite that far, but somewhere in that time frame. Can you imagine the time traveling with your brothers of what things that have occurred? This would have been a time somebody was fixing to blame somebody else. If you put brothers and sisters together for that amount of time, that closely together, You're probably going to have some fights along the way. You're probably going to have some arguing along the way. But Joseph here is saying this is not that time. This is serious. This is a time for joy. This is a time that you're coming to me and we're going to take care of you. Joseph is going to rescue his family and he's going to provide for them there in Egypt. The brothers are going to return home though, and I would have loved to heard how this story went when they would explain that Joseph is alive. Of course, when he's told of this in Genesis 45, 26 and 28, Jacob is stunned. And he proclaims that I must see my son before he dies. As we jump into chapter 46, Jacob here begins to prepare for his journey to Egypt. Now, Jacob's family stops in Beersheba along the way, which is one of the most southernmost towns there in the Promised Land. And the Lord comes to Jacob in a vision to tell him, he said, not to be afraid to go. God will make a great nation out of Jacob there in Egypt. So think about this. This shows the fact here that Jacob was holding on to God's promises that had already been made to him. And he didn't want to leave. He was not supposed to leave. So Jacob is fearful about going on into Egypt. God comes to Jacob though and he tells him, he said, don't be afraid. He came to him in a dream. He said, go ahead and move. Move to Egypt and God will fulfill the promises to him in Egypt. In 46 and verse 4, he said that God himself will go with Jacob to Egypt and he will bring Jacob back to the promised land. Joseph will close his eyes when he dies. So with these promises that was given to Jacob here, Jacob leaves the promised land and he moves on to Egypt. In Genesis 46, 6 through 27, you have a record there of Jacob's family who moved to Egypt. We're told at the very end of that verse number 27 that a group of 70 persons in total of Jacob's family are in Egypt now. Most places you would not think of that many people. That would be a strain. If you was involved, I think back to when we had our little pandemic or whatever it was, and you couldn't buy certain items around anywhere, that people was just in a uproar over trying to stockpile things. And you have people here that's willing to bring 70 people into their midst, knowing that there's going to be 5 more years of this famine that's taking place. Joseph goes on and he prepares a chariot to go see his father, who he's not seen in more than 20 years. You can imagine the reunion that they were having with one another. Hugging, crying. Jacob says in verses 29 and 30 that he will be able to die in peace, knowing that Joseph is still alive. I want us to be able to get to this place to where we can say, and we can believe it, and we can accept God did this. Wouldn't it be great to be able to say, God put me here? We've seen Joseph was working through all of these hardships and all of these trials that he had had through his life, starting as a teenager at 17 years old. At this one moment here in this text and in this time, he has come to realize God put me here. everything clicks. The whole picture, the whole story makes sense. He's able to understand this important truth, and he proclaims it even to his own brothers. God put me here. God did this. And I sat around and wonder, how was Joseph able to show this kind of kindness to his brothers? Joseph understood that God had put him there. I still question, how was he able to do this? To repay evil with goodness. You don't need to be angry. God did this. God was involved. God was working. I want us to see that this truth is not specific, though, to just Joseph. But this truth is about God with his people in this world. What did Job understand about his difficulties? If you listen to a couple of things that he said in a couple of verses, in Job chapter 1, 21 and 22, and he said, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." In all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrong. In chapter 2, he follows up. Should we accept only good from God and not adversity? Throughout all of this, Job did not sin in what he said. This week, as I was kind of reading through this and studying some of this, it's amazing when you start looking at stuff, then certain things start popping up, that you have on your computer or on your phone or different things. And this quote popped up on my phone one day this week. And it says, "If God can take away something you've never expected losing, He can replace it with something you never imagined having." And that hit home for me. That went with this perfectly for me. If God can take away something you've never expected losing, He can replace it with something you've never imagined having. Job proclaimed twice there that God did this. The Lord gave, the Lord take away. We have a hard time when God takes away. We have no problem giving credit when God is good, when God has blessed us. Sometimes we get upset when we have adversity. In that same text there, Job makes it clear that he did not sin. Job was simply right. This is how each one of us has to strive each and every day to try to look at our life. God put me here. God's working here. God did this. If we listen to what Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 7 and 9, he says, "So to keep me from becoming conceited, because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, a thorn was given to me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan, to harass me, to keep me from becoming conceited. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me, but He said to me, 'My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all more gladly of my weakness, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me.'" Paul understood this process. This is not a new process that we've read about or studied about going through the Bible. This was that thorn of the flesh, that messenger of Satan that was there to harass. But 3 times, God said, "We're going to leave it. We're staying with you, Paul. In this weakness, I'm making you stronger. My grace is sufficient for you. My power is being made perfect." God is working so that we can see that He is in charge. Paul preached this same thing in Acts 17, 24 through 28. "In Him we live and move and exist." Our very existence comes from God. One of the keys to forgiveness, to peace, and for doing good in the face of evil is to know that God put me here. Think about that. God's working. God sent me in this moment, whatever this moment is. God has us here, right now, in whatever circumstance that you're living in right now. And the only way that we move forward in these relationships is to see that God put us here. And then we need to respond the way that we have the biblical examples of people responding. God has put me here to do good during difficulty. Back to some of the things we talked about this morning. You see, Joseph say this in Genesis 45, 5 and 7 twice, states that God has put me here to preserve life. I am here to do good. That is why God has me here now. Whatever you're going through, whatever things that might be going through, God put me here. So do good, do what's right, knowing that God is at work. As we kind of prepare to close, let's think about in Joseph's story how we can see God's plan. Throughout the Old Testament, you have seen the foreshadowing of Christ throughout Joseph's life's events. In Joseph's life, we're able to clearly see what Jesus would do perfectly for the world. You see, God put Jesus in the right position. Through our sinning, He put Him there to preserve our lives from eternal punishment. The apostles also made this same point in their sermons in Acts chapter 4, verses 23 through 30. Even though they crucified Jesus, it was God who did this. And it was part of His predetermined plan. But Jesus, He spent some time in that pit too, right? He was down in the hole. He was in the hole. He was in the tomb. God raised Him from that tomb. He raised Him from that pit. And He set Him over all of creation so that whoever would come to Jesus wouldn't be destitute, but you'd be given all the provisions of life that you need. In fact, the offer is so generous, Joseph told his family what? He told them to leave everything behind. Come to Egypt so that you can enjoy all the riches of the land. The same thing that Jesus is telling us today. He said, leave it all behind. You don't need it. I've got everything you could possibly ever need. Leave it. Follow me so that you can enjoy those riches that my Father has prepared for you in heaven. As we leave it all behind and come to Him, the riches of the kingdom, He gives us just a few more instructions. Don't argue and fight along the way. You're coming to the riches of eternity, so don't fight about it. Those things that are behind us, we can put them behind us. God said, I'll forgive you, I'll forget about it. It's over. Never to be remembered, never to be called upon again, if we're willing to ask for forgiveness of us. So don't remember it. Don't worry about what you've done in the past. You can make it all right today. God put us here. We don't fight as our journey goes along. Think about it this way. Why would you want to die in the famine when you can enjoy all the riches of God's eternal throne? We talked about that distance traveled a while ago. Miles, hundreds of miles, several days to complete that journey. Tonight, your journey could only be a few feet to escape the famine and enjoy the riches of eternity. All you have to do hurry home, hurry down the aisle, ask God to forgive you. We'd love to pray for you. Maybe you've not become a Christian. It's time you want to do that. Come down the aisle. Respond to that invitation to come to those great riches and live eternally with our Heavenly Father. All that we ask you to do is you come forward as we stand and sing.